Thank you for joining us this evening for our Bold Energy Builders Nebraska webinar this evening. We have two excellent people to get us going on the right foot and learning how we're going to help America with clean energy and discuss our community benefits agreement and also the American dividend. And to join us, we have Jane Kleeb. She is the experienced grassroots organizer, author, manager, political strategist, and nonprofit entrepreneur. She founded Bold in 2010 with the goal of bringing together rural and urban Nebraskans to change the political landscape of the state of Nebraska. After stopping the KXL pipeline, Bold Nebraska grew into the Bold Alliance, which I'm a member of, and so is Emma, who's running the show in the background there. Jane was named a Climate Breakthrough Awardee in 2023 and launched Energy Builders, which works with rural communities to change the economic model of large-scale clean energy projects to benefit the people who live on the land that is creating America's next 100 years of energy. We also have Sean Flowerday. He has joined us from Lancaster County. He's a Lancaster County Commissioner for District 1. He is a proud product of the Lincoln Public School System and earned a degree in public safety. Sean began his career in public service as an aide in the Nebraska State Legislature for State Legislature ML Dirks before moving on to work as a field director for the Nebraska Democratic Party. He then took a job as a correctional officer with the Nebraska Department of Correctional Services. Sean left corrections to take a supervisory position with Pathfinder Support Services, which is a child welfare agency working in our community with at-risk kids. Sean's priority areas of interest for Lancaster County are obviously renewable energy development, county fiscal accountability and stability, criminal justice reform, workers' rights, and human services. So thank you for joining both Jane and Sean. We welcome you, and we will start off with Jane with her presentation, and let's go for it.
Thanks, Shelli. And thanks everybody for joining us, and those who might be watching this online afterwards. We're going to record this and post it on the Bold Nebraska website and Facebook page, and then on the Energy Builder site. I'm so happy to be with you. Many of you may know me as a pipeline fighter. You know, we spent 13 years at the grassroots level working to stop the Keystone XL pipeline from taking land by eminent domain and destroying native cultural resources like the Ponca Trail of Tears. We were proud to stop that pipeline. And we also have helped communities stop 8 different pipelines that were risking not only property rights and tribal nations' cultural resources, but were threatening water supplies and weren't going to diversify the energy base. You know, that's why Bold decided to get involved in working with rural communities to build clean energy with a much different model. We're going to get into some of the misconceptions and misinformation that oil corporations and other fossil fuel projects are pushing around clean energy, which has really caused a major divide, especially in rural communities, where anywhere from 30 to 40% of clean energy projects, wind and solar in particular, are being stopped at the local level. Not because it's not good energy to add to the grid, not because this would diversify our energy base, but because there's a lot of misinformation about what's happening. We will also get into some things that we do think clean energy companies need to do better in order to bring the community on board with these projects and to leave more money behind in the communities that are shouldering the development of the clean energy build out. So in today's presentation, what we're going to cover, we'll just go over some goals. We're going to talk about who we are and what we do. We're going to talk about some common concerns and questions. We are going to introduce you to 2 new ideas that we have around clean energy called the Community Benefits Agreement and an American Energy Dividend. We're going to show you some concrete examples of how other people have done this in other states. And then I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Flowerday to give his own experience as a county commissioner, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So first, let me get to just our general goal as energy builders. Our goal is to build more wind and solar projects. We believe that we have to diversify our energy grid in order to bring energy freedom to communities in America, as well as to build wealth in our rural communities. So we are not an organization that believes let's just build wind and solar everywhere to build wind and solar everywhere. We have a lot of conditions, if you will, on how we're building this. So we're doing it the right way. And from our perspective, if coal, oil, and gas would have done this 80 to 100 years ago when those projects were being built out across our country, we would be better off today. And how do we do this? We're organizing unlikely alliances, really similar to what we did on Keystone XL or the Byhalia pipeline or Jordan Cove pipeline or all these other projects that we've worked on, where we bring together people who may not normally agree with each other: farmers, ranchers, tribal nations, energy advocates, environmentalists, union workers, and community members. So Bold got our start right here in Nebraska. I live in Hastings, Nebraska, and we started Bold to really create a bridge between rural and urban Nebraskans. About 6 months to a year after we started Bold, the Keystone XL pipeline issue came up, and that then defined who we were as an organization. Since we stopped Keystone and in between that fight, we were actually helping a lot of other states and communities in protecting their land and water and sharing all the best practices we developed around fighting Keystone XL, like easement action teams, where we were protecting landowners' legal rights in a collective legal group. That led us to also working on clean energy projects, because we were seeing in the very same communities that were being bullied around fossil fuel projects, um, people's voices weren't being heard like we thought they should around wind and solar. So we decided to start this new project called Energy Builders to really get more utility scale projects onto the grid and to make sure that we're generating wealth not only for the people who get the wind and solar on their projects, but for folks who live near those projects as well. In Nebraska, we have Shelli Meyer, who you heard at the introduction of this presentation, who is our lead staff person for all the projects that Bold, Nebraska is working on. Energy Builders is clearly one of those. We also continue to work on pipelines, and increasingly, which won't be this presentation, but I'm sure we'll have a presentation soon. Increasingly, we're also getting involved in data centers and kind of all the risks of data centers and how we need to build more clean energy in order to fuel data centers, so that increasing bills on our shoulders. But that's a whole other presentation. But that's coming, and data centers are facing communities, both urban and rural, all across our country. Shelli was working in Iowa, which is how we met Shelli. We've been working to stop the Summit carbon pipeline. Shelli was also working with Emma, who's working the slides today, on the Navigator and Wolf pipeline. Those two pipelines we were able to stop on the carbon pipelines. But Shelli has land, and her family has land in Dixon County since 1924. And she is a huge asset to not only Bold, but to our entire state. So where are we going for the next 100 years, right? When I talk about the Energy Builders Project with communities, with landowners who have concerns about wind and solar, I always try to remind us that we now are at a point in America's energy where we do have to build out the next 100 years of our energy infrastructure. Oil, gas, and coal did build America, and we're proud of that development. But it's also time now to recognize the pollution that came with some of those energy projects, as well as to decide how are we building out and diversifying our energy sources over the next 100 years. And if you know me, and if you'll get to know Shelli more, and Sean on camera soon, and Emma, everybody at Bold believes that rural people are the backbone of our country and deserve to have a much louder and stronger voice at the table as we develop these energy projects. So in the next 100 years, we know that energy demands are increasing. You'll see a graph on your screen right now that shows, from 2024 and then the expectation of where we're going to be in 2030. Data centers are a huge part of this energy growth, but so is transportation, so is residential use, so is warehouse use. But no matter what sector you want to put the energy growth on, the reality is we need more energy. This is not a situation where we can just conserve, which was kind of a talking point even in the 70s and 80s, and that rose again even in the early 2000s. This is America being faced with the fact that we need to build more energy. Yes, do as much conservation as possible, but we're at a space where we need to build more energy. And we believe that rural America has the ability and the land to build wind and solar projects at utility scale that can bring energy freedom to our communities, to our country, that can also leave a ton more money in our pockets. And sometimes when we describe this, it gets a little scary because it's change. Just like when utility poles were going up in the 40s and 50s all across our state, especially in rural Nebraska, that was a massive change. And people were complaining about those utility poles going up. But we've done change in Nebraska, right? A lot of us come from ag families where we've seen the changes in the size of the equipment that we're using, where farmers used to, only serve for 10, 30, 40 acres. Now it's 400 plus acres because the machines are bigger and they're a lot more efficient. The same is true for our energy, right? Our energy systems need to change. We definitely believe that rural communities not only feed the world, but we can power America. Many of us know when we're walking into or driving through or driving, to a rural town, you often see a billboard being very proud about feeding the world on that same land and a very small portion of that same land. Bold believes that we can power America and that we can do that with energy that doesn't pollute our land and water. So first, let me go through some common concerns and questions that we often hear when we're doing either one-on-one meetings with landowners or elected officials, or when we're doing workshops in the community. First is around emissions and pollution. We often hear that wind and solar emit just as much pollution than the fossil fuel projects. First of all, we all can agree that we need clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. And we know for fact that wind and solar do not produce emissions once they're built. And they certainly don't risk our water supply. If you look at the life cycle of emissions, and sometimes, I try to remind some of my climate advocate friends that, are more focused on building clean energy for climate change, when Bold is more focused on building energy to leave money behind in rural communities and to diversify our grid. So Bold comes at this from kind of a different perspective. But I often hear from folks that, wind and solar still emit emissions. And it is true. When wind and solar projects are being built, especially the utility scale projects that we're talking about, they do emit some greenhouse gases because you're using big trucks, you're using a construction equipment, that all has fossil fuels. But once the wind and solar projects are in production, once they are installed, they produce zero emissions. Meanwhile, as you can see on screen, coal, oil, and gas continue to produce a massive amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I know some folks may think that producing greenhouse gas emissions is no problem and that is fine for the environment and doesn't impact climate change, or that the climate is always changing. And it is true that our climate is always changing. But what fossil fuel do to our air is pollute that air that we breathe. If you live near a coal plant, you are more likely to have asthma and heart problems and have a higher mortality rate. That is also true if you're living near oil and gas refineries. So there is a way that we can produce energy in a better way. Another common thing that we hear is around decommissioning. Look, Bold is a supporter 110% of making sure that any energy project is required to decommission. We do not have, on a national or state level, a law that requires fossil fuel pipelines or coal plants to be decommissioned, meaning all the equipment removed, land restored once that project is finished. That should be a requirement at the national level, at the state level, and at a county level. It is a requirement in our counties that are putting permits together at the county level in their zoning process. There are also states that have done this for wind and solar projects, including Illinois. Bold believes we should have energy parity, that if we're going to require wind and solar to decommission, which we should, that we should also be requiring pipelines to decommission in coal plants as well. Another big area of concern is around land use and property rights. Bold is firmly against the use of eminent domain for private gain. We do not believe that pipelines should be able to use eminent domain to take people's land against their will. And right now, in all 57 states and territories, there is no law that I'm aware of, and if you can prove me wrong, I'd be happy to be proved wrong, that allows wind and solar projects to take land for by eminent domain against a landowner's wishes. Wind and solar projects, even the utility scale ones, are built with a easement that a wind and solar company creates with a landowner, a private landowner, or with a county or a state on public land. So there is no eminent domain used for wind and solar projects to install on the land. And we firmly are against that use. But when you look at land use specifically, because this is a myth that I often hear, and I'm hearing it more and more in a lot of ag communities because it's clearly something that the oil and gas industry are pushing with their disinformation campaign. They're often showing share graphics and talking points about wind and solar is taking away prime ag land. Well, a couple things. One, it's just a myth. When you look at the graph that is on your screen, and we have this on the Energy Builders website as well, all of the fossil fuel projects across the United States take about 8.5 million acres of land, about the size of the state of Maryland. Wind and solar projects take about 0.6 million acres of land, about the size of Rhode Island. And then ethanol and biofuels, which we support at Bold, that takes 52 million acres of land. So when I hear people say, well, wait a second, I don't want wind and solar being built in our rural communities on prime ag land, that definitely falls on deaf ears to me for this main reason. We proudly grow a lot of corn in our state. In fact, anywhere from 75 to 85% of the corn in the state of Nebraska is used for ethanol. That's prime ag land. That's not being growing food, that's growing energy. The same way that wind and solar are going to be built on land to grow energy. We don't take nearly, not even close to the amount of land that ethanol or fossil fuels do. So when folks argue that we can't build wind and solar because it will take prime ag land out of production, that is a myth. And it is a talking point from the fossil fuel corporations. When you look at other land use, 27 million acres of farmland, almost 20 million is considered prime out of that 27 million. And if you look just in Illinois as one example, the farmland that would be used for wind and solar to scale is a sliver of all the other prime farmland. So you won't see an environmental group that is more pro property rights, pro farm and ranch than Bold. And we proudly believe that we can do both. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of innovation in around land use and wind and solar is when you're basically coupling both the wind and solar development with ag production. Now, we haven't figured this out for cattle yet. Cattle are much bigger, and if they were underneath this solar panel, they would probably knock it down. So when we're talking about cattle in like feedlots, for example, that is potentially one area that you could do combining solar and cattle. You could put solar panels on the top of shade, which more and more feedlots are needing because our summers are getting hotter. But for smaller critters, this is definitely an option. Sheep is definitely clearly one of those. The other thing that we're seeing farmers being very innovative on is with bee production around solar farms and definitely growing different types of crops that are friendly to being able to grow wind and solar. The big takeaway from my perspective on land use is that land is not lost. It's still producing something very valuable, and that's energy, right? And that's American energy, energy that we don't have to import from Saudi Arabia, and energy that's not getting exported to a different country. This is energy that Americans are using. Another big myth that we hear is around reliability. We hear often at community meetings, we can't build wind and solar because it's not as reliable as coal, oil, or gas. And in fact, this is a talking point that is being used right now in Nebraska, in North Omaha, by OPPD management, which is basically trying to tell the North Omaha community we're going back on our promise of transitioning from coal to gas because we need reliable energy for data centers and growth. Well, when you have the proper battery systems and battery storage in place, and Commissioner Flowerday can talk about the battery storage that they approved recently in Lancaster County, you are able to have reliable energy. And solar and wind definitely work. And you will sometimes see wind turbines stopped, just like you have coal and gas plants that are often offline as well. This is true for all energy production. The last one we hear, and the one easiest to combat, is birds. This was one that we heard, I would say, even 5 years ago. This was the main talking point that the opposition would use against wind projects in particular. We have a fun graph. I'm a cat lover. We have two beautiful cats here at the house. We have three out at the farm. So I apologize to making the cats seem like murderers, but they are. I mean, my cat brings birds to our doorstep on a regular basis. Cats, buildings, and our own vehicles kill way more birds than wind turbines do. And I'm not minimizing that wind turbines do kill birds. They do. We have the number right on the screen. We acknowledge that fact. But to say that we're not going to produce wind because it kills birds would basically be saying we're also not going to be building buildings, having cars, or having cats. We don't have on this screen the amount of wildlife that is killed by fossil fuel pollution, or wildlife that flies into tailing ponds of pollution from refineries. Those also kill birds. And those same people who are saying we can't have wind because it kills birds are certainly also not saying that we can't have oil and gas development. So, with all of this misinformation and disinformation, you may be wondering who is spreading it. There is no question there have been studies about this. There are also things that we have seen in discovery of lawsuits where fossil fuel corporations since the 1950s have known that their energy is producing pollution and causing climate change to accelerate. And they have also known that clean energy is coming onto the grid and coming into one of those energy sources that we could potentially be building to diversify, but that would mean less money in their pocket. So the people who are spreading the most disinformation about clean energy is big oil and fossil fuel corporations. But here's what we think we can do differently. We think we can tell wind and solar companies that are wanting to come into our rural towns that we want them to be building these projects differently. And we want more money being left in people's pockets. That's where something called the Community Benefit Agreements and American Energy Dividend comes into play. In short, because I'm going to describe what this means, but in short, you should know that basically those community benefits and American Energy Dividends means that you in a rural community can ask and should be asking for more. So what does this mean? What is a CBA? A CBA is a community benefit agreement. And we think that this is one way that we can solve a big problem that we're facing. One of the problems that we're facing in communities where 30 to 40% of wind and solar projects are being denied is development projects often promise benefits to residents. And they often talk about those benefits will be property taxes. But if you're a citizen, you already believe that the taxes you're paying should be making sure that your roads are paved and your public schools have the funding. So this is like new tax dollars that should be adding new benefits to your community. So I love that wind and solar projects pay property tax. I like when oil and gas companies pay property tax, even though they often use loopholes to not pay it, oil and gas companies. But the solution to this problem of not getting enough benefits to the local community is with a community benefit agreement. This basically says a corporation's coming into your community and they want to build a big project. They normally will go to your county or your city, whoever has permission to grant a permit, and promise property taxes. Or they'll throw out a little grant dollars to a nonprofit in the area. But a community benefit is an actual legal contract that requires very clear items, and we'll walk you through some of those that we think rural communities should be asking wind and solar projects for. But first, like some basic principles of an effective community benefit agreement, you got to make sure that your community interests are well represented and that this isn't written by a for-profit corporation, right? So you don't want the wind and solar company writing the CBA. You want a community group or a community group in conjunction with elected officials. You want the process to be transparent, inclusive, and accessible, meaning even people who are opposed to the project should be at the table in developing the CBA. You want to make sure in plain terms that the benefits are really clear and meaningful, not $1,000 to the entire county per year, but that they really do leave real wealth behind in a community. And then you want to make sure that there's mechanisms in the community benefit agreement that keep the corporation accountable if they are not living up to their end of the bargain. And then we have something called an American Energy Dividend. This is something that Bold has created. Community benefits agreements have been being used mostly in real estate projects like big arenas. And a few solar and wind projects have been using them across the country. But that's not a new concept. A new concept that we have developed at Bold is the American Energy Dividend. What normally happens with clean energy projects is the individuals that get the wind and solar on their property are usually the only ones that get the financial benefits in the easement, right? So sometimes it's $30,000, sometimes it's up to $60,000 that a landowner will get per turbine on their property. The idea behind an American Energy Dividend is that the landowners that are having the project on their land, they should still get that larger easement payment. But we believe people who live within a mile or 2 miles of an energy project should also be getting an annual dividend. They should be getting $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. Some wind and solar projects have done what they called good neighbor agreements, but those haven't been part of a community benefit and contract that we put in front of communities. That's the difference. And we want to make this a status quo operation of any energy project that's happening in our community where people who are impacted, who will be seeing the 200 wind turbines, who will be seeing the massive solar projects that are being built, they deserve to get more money in their pockets as well. So you may be wondering how you create a CBA. We know how to do it at Bold because we've done it with the Tallgrass carbon pipeline that transitioned from a gas to a carbon pipeline. We successfully negotiated a CBA and dividend payment there. And we also just helped a community group up in North Dakota do this on a 200 plus wind project. So first, you should know that anyone in the community can start this process. So if you're on this webinar or you're watching this webinar because you've heard a potential wind or solar project is coming to your community, or you want to encourage a wind and solar project to come to your community, you can start the process of creating a community benefits coalition where you get together other neighbors, other community members, even members of the opposition, and start to discuss what you would want to see out of that wind and solar project. The second step that you would want to do is start conducting community meetings. You can't just pull a CBA out of thin air. Maybe the first draft you can, but you want to get feedback. You know, in North Dakota, the residents really wanted to save a historic theater that was totally falling apart. They included that into their community benefit and dividend agreement with the wind project. Maybe it's a nursing home, maybe it's daycare, maybe it's a community pool. That should be unique to your community on what you're asking for. The third step is engaging local and state government officials. At some point, the government is going to be involved in permitting the wind and solar project. So getting them on board and asking them to include even the CBA and the dividend agreement into their permitting process is one thing that is a possibility. It could also be a totally separate contract, not attached to the permitting process. So you could go in either way. In some counties, may not allow kind of this private contract to be in your permitting process. So you do it separately as an agreement between the community and a community group and the wind and solar development. The fourth step is to make sure that this is a legally binding contract. Bold does not charge communities a dime to have our lawyers look at your draft CBA and American Energy Dividend. And in fact, on our website, we have a base CBA and dividend agreement that you could start with when you're holding your community meetings. It's a good base contract that you could start and then build and tailor it to be your own. You also want to make sure that you have an accountability partner. Bold is the accountability partner to the Tallgrass CBA. Shelli, in fact, is the one that if landowners feel like their land wasn't cleaned up properly or they're not getting their dividend payment, which would start next year, Shelli is the accountability partner, and then we contact the company. You want to make sure that that is written into the agreement on who people who have concerns and how do they get that problem solved. Basically, with a community benefit and an American dividend, you don't have to take our word for the success of this. There are lots of good examples actually that are happening in our state that show that these wind and solar projects can actually help develop the local economy as well as help landowners in their pockets. In fact, one landowner, Ryan, in Pierce County, when that project went up, he really talked about how the ag economy has been so difficult, and we know that obviously firsthand in Nebraska. So diversifying their operation, making sure that a wind and solar project is on ag land, helps put money directly in people's pockets. Some other examples of American Energy dividends is right here in Nebraska for tallgrass. We negotiated up to $1 million every year will go out to new payments to landowners. That's beyond the easement payment that they were paid for the pipeline. This is annual dividends because if we believe that if an energy company is making money annually, so should the people who this project is being built on and built in their community. In addition to landowners getting a dividend, we made sure that there is an annual community fund of $1 million, up to $1 million every year, that the community decides where that goes. In our community benefit agreement, we decided that nursing homes, childcare centers, and food banks in the counties that the pipeline was crossing were in the most need of resources. So we developed a process that those groups in those counties can request money with the community fund that we've set up, and that's being set up with the Nebraska Community Foundation. There are other examples of payments directly to landowners. In Michigan, over $118 million, for example, has gone out in payments, and then an additional $175 million in personal income. So that's both easement and then personal income. Another example of the CBA, component of the CBA in Nebraska that we did to protect landowners was we made sure, and this should be true, and it is true for every wind and solar easement I've seen in our state, is that once the project is decommissioned, that the easement gets returned to the landowners. That's not true for pipelines in our state, by the way. The easements that pipeline companies often put onto the shoulders of landowners says that they own that easement forever. Tallgrass was willing to make sure that when their project's decommissioned, that easement gets returned to the landowners. I'm going to quickly go through these next two slides because these figures are large and sometimes you can't get your head around them. But we also wanted to make the point, and I know Sean will make this point too, Commissioner Flowerday, that it also goes beyond what the community gets in community benefits and grants and what landowners who live near projects will get with the American Energy Dividend. There's also real money being paid to counties. And we don't diminish that. We think that that needs to continue to happen, and that is literally saving some county budgets, including here in Nebraska. You'll see the figures on the screen in Hawaii and in New York, for example, of what's been happening. You also see where some counties say the new tax revenue that is coming in, we are going to say where that new revenue is going. So they, for example, have done that now in California. We think it's important to also point out in Mississippi, a wind and solar company there opened up a process where any community group can ask for money, and they do $1,000 to $10,000 grants. That's another creative, innovative way to make sure that money is getting to the local community groups. The other thing that we work with in community benefits agreements is making sure that we're making it very clear that we expect the wind or solar company to use prevailing wages and utilize local labor. We also want to see union jobs being created. So those benefits go beyond the construction, but are also in the process of maintaining the project. In Hawaii, for example, in the CBA, they wrote in that there was local worker preference and they kept them accountable for that. And it meant more people locally were getting jobs rather than folks coming from outside the community. Another example of something written into a CBA is what happened in Saunders County. The community really wanted to see more shelter belts, basically, being built around a big, large scale solar project. They wanted to see more trees being put there so it was more of a natural visual buffer. That's absolutely something that you can put into a CBA. The other things that you can put into CBA are equipment for first responders. We know that when you have a massive wind and solar project or battery storage, you want to make sure that the first responders are prepared to deal with any worst case scenarios. So you can build that into a CBA. You could build an annual public safety notification into your CBA talking about the project. But the key takeaways for community benefits and American energy dividends is that no question, this is change for our communities, right? Seeing large scale wind and solar project is a change. And your questions about these projects are valid. You're absolutely in your right to say, if a big corporation is going to make X dollars on a wind and solar project, the community should be making a share of that. You can and should be asking for more in community benefit agreements as well as in American energy dividends. We certainly believe that when we are building more wind and solar, that you are going to help bring energy freedom to our country. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Sean Flowerday. Sean is a friend, a colleague. I've known Sean for many years. He is now also an elected Lancaster County Commissioner. He's been faced with decisions where they, as a county, need to decide on permitting large scale wind and solar and battery projects. So I'm going to turn it to Sean to talk a little bit about his experience, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Hey there. Sorry, I got a 20-month-old who's kind of having a hard time sitting still with me this whole time. His mom's a CASA volunteer, and so I've got him tonight. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for being on this tonight. This is really desperately important work. I can't really stress enough how over the next in the late 2000s, we were always talking about the energy crisis. Everyone was always going on about that. About 10 years back, I think a lot of people would have told you that as a nation, we have we have largely reached a point where energy wasn't going to be as much of an issue going forward. It was certainly a concern. We needed generation, we needed to increase our capacity, but it wasn't the same demand that we had back around the turn of the century. All the projections from 10 years ago have been blown utterly out of the water. We are back in a massive energy deficit, a massive energy crisis. We need every electron we can get. And that's what I really appreciate about Bolt's mission here. Hey, buddy, he'll tell you, he wants more energy capacity. The demands that data centers, the demands that AI have put on the economy and our state's capacity to grow is really going to mean we need all the generation we can get. And by far and away, the cheapest and the fastest to create is wind and solar. It's not even close. Even without the federal credits, wind and solar are still cheaper options. So the work that we're doing here at Bold is just so crucial for that. As far as the county side of things, I want to talk a little bit about sort of my experience working with different companies. Some have my guy's really having a hard time sitting still here. Some of these companies have done a really remarkably good job of bringing the community in. Hey, buddy. Sorry, guys.
No, that's okay, Sean. I can take over.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Um, I know some of what Sean is saying because I've been in the room as he's developed the work that he's doing with the community. The reality is that our counties are often faced with these decisions, and you, as community residents, have a responsibility and obligation to go and work with the county elected officials. But I think there's also some myths that, county commissioners are in cahoots with clean energy companies or maybe even fossil fuel corporations. I think the important thing is that counties are really doing their duty and their job to develop more clean energy to diversify our grid. And it's bringing a ton more financial benefits, not only to the landowners and people who live near them, but also to the county. And that Nebraska should be in the top 5 of building wind and solar. And we're not right now. Texas is clearly one of those states that's very proud of their oil and gas tradition, but has also been developing wind and solar at a much faster pace than other states.
Depending on the numbers you look at, Nebraska should be around second or third best in the nation, and we are woefully underperforming that. Last time I saw, I think we were somewhere in the 30s.
Yeah.
We have really missed the bus, while a bunch of our neighboring states have barely been able to take advantage of this. Now, I absolutely think that we need to be encouraging these companies to do a better job of coordinating with the community. As a county commissioner, I've worked with some of these companies to negotiate quality of life setbacks, to negotiate increased screening, like you saw in Saunders County. Actually, I believe that the increased screening in Saunders County was based on some of the stuff we had already done in Lancaster. We also have negotiated agreements between these companies and the local first responders, the local volunteer fire departments, to provide additional training, additional access to their sites so they can go and inspect them ahead of time and build public safety plans. And then we've always included decommissioning plans. I really strongly agree with Bold. All of these things should have decommissioning plans. We shouldn't be able to build generation sites of any kind without a decommissioning plan.
Thanks, Sean.
So
Why don't we open it up for questions to see if folks have things you want myself or Sean, Commissioner Flowerday, to answer?
I don't see anything in the chat right now, other than the climate caucus mentioned that think of wildlife that is killed by oil spills. So that's one thing. That's one comment. My question is
but
to
add
get
that the Audubon Society is strongly in favor of wind and solar generation, and have actually taken a stance that they believe that climate change is killing more animals and more birds than renewable energy generation.
Yeah.
yeah. So I guess I'll start off with a question about the use of eminent domain in Nebraska on these solar and wind projects. I've been to several meetings with Dakota County and certain counties in the area, and there was no mention they weren't using eminent domain. So how is that stance in Nebraska for using eminent domain for these types of projects? Is that something that is being used? Because to me, I'm not seeing that as being used as part of that.
Yeah.
I don't believe it's ever been used in Nebraska, full stop. I don't
It's
think there's
never.
any examples of it. I think that's one of the fossil fuel talking points that has been thrown around that is just misinformation.
Yeah. In fact, our eminent domain law in Nebraska says that eminent domain cannot be used for private gain. When Deb Fisher was a state senator, she did a carve out for oil and gas pipelines. No surprise.
Lovely. Lovely.
So, wind and solar wouldn't even be eligible for eminent domain, but they've never used it and they've never attempted to use it. They've never attempted to change our state law because they've been able to negotiate land rights with willing landowners. So, I think this occasionally will come up in the argument around um, the grid and putting up more utility poles to connect the wind and solar projects to the grid. Now, the grid is literally like a road. That is public use. Different types of energy not only patch into the grid, but we need the grid as citizens in order to make sure that lights go on when we turn on the light switch. Um, and even that in our state, like with the R line, which has been very controversial in our state, and MPPD working to change that route, uh, even then it's used in very small amounts, but that's considered a public use project, not a private use project.
Okay.
And
There's a
any,
question from there. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Sam.
just add on that, any public domain or eminent domain that has been used to, increase the grid, we need the increased generation. That's going to happen whether or not it's gas, coal, whatever. It's going to happen whether it's renewable energy or not. So that's just like Jane said. I mean, that's just building out. It's like road infrastructure. That's the best way to think about it. It's an electrical road.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's right.
Okay. There's a question in the chat from Eric Moyer. You might know him. What are your recommendations for addressing erroneous zoning and siting requirements enacted by counties to restrict development of wind and solar assets?
Yeah. Eric is a good friend and running for office for folks that don't know, and is a clean energy expert. This is one of the biggest obstacles that we're facing, and advocates like all of us on the screen here, the opposition groups beat us, I would say, for the last 5 to 6 years when they have been in our state and in other states pushing setbacks that are a mile or 2 mile. That is not a safety issue. That is a strategy to make sure that wind projects are not being built in a community. So they're being very dishonest and unethical about their setbacks. Setbacks and zoning requirements are meant to keep the community safe. Like when we advocate as Bold for setbacks on pipelines, because pipelines were as close as 100 feet of people's front doors, that's to keep them safe. In a worst case scenario, how do you make sure that a community is safe? That's what a setback is. And there should be setbacks for wind and solar. Sean created setbacks for Lancaster County, but they're
Yep.
not a mile because he knows with good science and public safety what a setback should be.
Right. For wind, they should be based off the height of the turbine. We did a 3.5 times the height of the turbine for a non-participating landowner's home, like dwelling where people are actually living. And so it's, I mean, you get a 500-foot turbine, you're talking 1,700 feet. I mean, you're talking close to, a third of a mile there. So these aren't minor things by any means.
Mhm.
To address Eric's question just a little bit, I doubt it's going to happen this year. I support a ban on ban legislation. I think local zoning should tell you how you have to do something. I don't think it should be able to stop something entirely. I think it's bad faith. And at a time when rural America is starving for, an infusion into the rural economy, this is really one of the only sectors of the economy that's trying to move into rural America. We shouldn't be preventing that kind of growth.
That's right.
So I know, and he says amen to that. So the other point or question I have is that I've attended several county commissioner meetings regarding solar farms, and the biggest, and I'm sitting in the back, so I'm listening to landowners talking to each other, and their biggest concern is, I don't want to look at that, which means the wind turbine. I don't want to look at that. How do you, to me, the property that turbine is on, that it's a property rights issue.
Of course it
And
is.
if I'm a half a mile, if I'm in the shadow of that, so that's where the CBA comes in. Can you explain how, I don't want to look at that, and how do you compensate me for looking at that piece of
Right.
crap that I think I'm looking at? So that's what I've heard in the being in the audience of some of these commissioner meetings.
Right. And I would tell you, I don't want to look at that is the most legitimate argument against these things. We all have a right to say whether or not, my kid's now moving the computer on me. We all have a right to say what we want and what we don't want in our neighborhoods and in our communities. What that doesn't translate into is, no, my neighbor's not allowed to do the thing that he's legally able
Exactly.
to do on
Exactly. Yes.
So that's where that comes to an end. But it's the most legitimate agreement, and it's why these companies need to be working with the communities on things like CBAs to invest. Because I'll tell you what, I mean, I've dealt with some of these companies when they go in and they build a new pool and a new track field for the local high school, that goes a long way. When they go in and they help outfit a couple of new fire trucks, that goes a long way for these areas. And we need to be encouraging more companies to do that because they can afford it and it's good for the whole community then.
Yeah, that's right. Shelli, also saw Jesse put in a question
Yes,
about
I
data
just saw that.
centers. Yeah.
Yep.
You want to read that for the people who watch later?
Yes, I can. Do you think wind and solar can keep pace with the new massive demand from data centers? Does Bold have a position on OPPD and PPD, LAS, signing NDAs with data center companies? Does Bold think our public utilities need to disclose the amounts of electricity the data centers use? And I will add
Yeah.
to that electricity and water. I
Hmm.
want to add water to that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so this is something that Bold has spent the last 6 months digging into, because as we're going to county commission meetings, not only in Nebraska, but in all the states that we're working on with wind and solar projects, data centers are becoming the top issue, even beyond wind and solar projects. So a couple things. One, we need a state law that grants the Public Service Commission, which is the most logical place to go, permitting process for data centers so we can get a handle on how many data centers are actually being proposed for our state because we're hearing rumors that up to 80 data centers are being proposed for our state. Nobody knows if that's true. Nobody knows how much energy it needs. Nobody knows how much water is going to be required or decommissioning. Like there's a laundry list of issues that come up with the amount of data centers that are being proposed. There's some concerns from elected officials like Commissioner Flowerday that, that this could be an overbuild. So we don't know until we have a process that data centers have to go through that is public and transparent. No entity in our state should be signing NDAs with a data center company. There is nothing proprietary about a data center. It is a fairly massive building that needs energy in order to make sure that things like the cell phones and computers that we have and AI and everything else that's happening in our world as it's changing, we realize that some data centers are going to need to be developed. But what shouldn't be happening, and where I think the consensus is that if it needs X amount of energy, they should then be responsible for developing X amount of energy, not relying on us as ratepayers to finance the development of that energy. Because that's exactly what's happening right now. Not only in Nebraska, but across the entire country, data centers are using a ton of energy. And instead of bringing their own energy, if you will,
Yes.
that's like, that's a acronym. We're not saying that every data center should, be literally be bringing their own energy, but they should be paying for the energy infrastructure that is needed to help supply them the energy that they need. And then there's
Texas
got to be guardrails around water and property rights. Yeah, go ahead,
Texas
Meyer.
just passed a law this spring saying that if a big data center or a large user like that tips the grid over into needing to build new generation to offset it, that they have to come up with some of the basically the startup capital to do that build.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So yes, we are on the data centers. You're going to be seeing a lot more from us. We're encouraging state senators to pass a law. Right now, unfortunately, a lot of the counties or NRDs are trying to figure this out in real time, not any different than what was happening around clean energy, 10, 20 years ago. So we should be providing some guardrails and a clear permitting process for data centers.
Hmm.
Yeah.
There was another question that came in. What do you say to people who are willing to have a concentrated animal feeding operation um, near them, but not a wind or solar farm?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets around to the issue of property rights. And I know
Right.
Mike, who's our, director in North Dakota, he's on the Zoom. He talks often about this, that I have a right as a landowner to put wind and solar on my property, knowing that, yes, that may impact my neighbors. And so that's where Bold comes in, is how are we mitigating some of those concerns of neighbors, making sure they're also getting wealth in their pockets. But it is very frustrating for us who live in rural communities to hear the same people who might even complain about an animal feeding, a CAFO basically, but aren't willing to come to the table to talk about what community benefits could we do in order to make sure that people are benefiting from the wind and solar project.
If
Right.
someone's,
And
oh,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Sean.
I
Oh,
was gonna
I
say,
was going to say, I was going to
go ahead.
say that Jane mentioned that I was living in Iowa. Now I live in Wayne, America. I moved back home to my hometown to take care of my parents so they can live on their family farm that we've had for a century, um, and so they can live there as long as they can. But I do have relatives that rent ground with a wind farm, and he does receive compensation for having to move around cranes at certain times of year, or if cranes have to come in and destroy some of his crop. So there's always those compromises that happen as those agreements happen. So we do have I do have that familiarity with that in the wind farms that are around Wayne County and Dixon County. We do have another question that came in. Do we need to accommodate that demand? Can we oppose them as a state with all public utilities? We can say no, question mark.
Yeah.
Does that expansion need to be stopped or
Yeah.
at least
I mean,
slowed?
Jesse, yep, this is such a good question. In our state constitution, which is what the public power entities will say, is we are required to provide energy to businesses and to residents. So on the one hand, no. But on the other hand, we are not required just to roll over and allow them to
Right.
build whatever data centers they want, knowing that Nebraska has such a cheap form of energy because we're public power. It's not surprising to me that Nebraska and states like Tennessee, which also has a version of public power, are being inundated with requests to build data centers because we have very cheap energy here and access to water. So, yes, we have to provide the energy, but no, we don't have to do it without guardrails. And that's the big question mark and responsibility now at the foot of the state legislature.
And it's the wrong fight to say that we don't want to stop growth. We don't want to stop the construction of anything. That's not what we should be focusing on. What we need to be focusing on is how to do it right.
That's right.
Yeah. The one
Yep.
thing that I would just say about if someone tells you that they would rather live next to a large scale CAFO rather than a wind farm, I would ask that person to come back and tell me that again after doing so for 1 year.
It's so true. It's true.
Are you talking about the flies or the smell, or is that what you're talking
The death farms, yeah.
Everything. Well, we like to keep these webinars at an hour, and we're right at that hour. So we don't want to overstay our welcome on your computer screen, but I want to thank Shelli for the work that she does on a daily basis all throughout our state. Emma, who you didn't get to meet on screen this time, but who is a total rock star on our team, is
about?
she's in charge of our Pipeline Fighters hub and all the projects that we're working on around pipelines. And of course,
Yep.
Commissioner Flowerday and his cute son, Mikey,
Mikey,
Yes.
um,
bye.
who
He's
this is
so
why we're
cute.
doing this work, right?
Bye bye, Mikey.
That's for him. It's for
Do
his
it.
generation coming up. His
That's
generation
right.
coming up.
Thank you, Nebraskans, for getting on, and we will see you. We'll be posting information about in-person community workshops that we're doing on this topic in the spring. We have those dates. We'll be publishing those on the Bold Facebook page and the Bold website. See you
Thank
all.
you, everybody.